bet that's a fairly unique signature. I bet that probably describes an individual pretty accurately. This is absolutely part of an open data release, but it has the potential to be revealing of an individual at a very precise level. So here's the final few thoughts. There is a huge challenge for us in the open data community. We want to put this data to work for good. That as we release more and more, even though it's anonymized, not about the individual directly, we're starting to generate almost a fragmented panopticon, something that if you put it all together, you get a more and more precise characterization of an individual or a group of individuals. And it's absolutely the case that the fundamental precondition for being open and sharing, and we've seen this in scientific practice, much of the anthropology around scientific practice and other forms of scholarship, to be prepared to share, there's an initial requirement for privacy, to understand what the data is saying, what the actual values implicit in that information are. And if we do get privacy breaches, whatever variety, whatever type of data, whether open or closed, personal, aggregate, anonymized, it will harm the general cause, because the level of appreciation of how these things are different and similar, how data is different and similar, is really so very much in need of a more sophisticated debate. And absolutely, at the end of the day, we have to turn to the point that in all of this, we can't fix it technically. What we fundamentally need is a notion of accountability, so that whenever I release data or use it, I have a sense of its provenance, where it came from, what its fair terms of use might be, what the expected trade-offs, benefits, opportunities, potential dangers are. I can't have any redress unless I have some sense of what the origins of the information are, or whether people using it are using it in a way that is in some sense appropriate or proportionate. So for me, privacy is, I use the term fundamental expectation. I use that because in our case law system in this country, privacy is simply defined as what a reasonable expectation is. And so for all that we will rant and decry what's being done with data, the responsibility is on all of us to maintain a high bar on what that reasonable expectation is. Simply because the information is there doesn't give people a perfect right to use it. In fact, we have lots of examples of legislation where the use of information to a particular decision is illegal. Employment age, employment and gender, employment and religion. We understand how this can be involved. But also we have to understand how the norms and conventions, regulations, soft law as well as hard law, need to evolve in a world in which this formerly scarce has become superabundant, where the superabundant can be put to very good ends, but unless we actually pay attention, it will be used to discriminate, to remove equity from individuals, which of course brings us into the whole debate around how data, big data, small data, personal data, non-personal data is and should be used. And thank you very much for your attention.
Nigel, thank you. Nigel, thank you very much for starting off with those useful and very well focused thoughts. I'm now going to invite each of the panelists in turn just to give us their 5 to 8 minute response to that, any points they thought they wanted to follow up on or hadn't been covered, but really to take us on the discussion. So let's start with Heather Brooke. Heather.
Hi everyone, Heather here. I really like that talk. I guess I would sort of classify myself as a recovering techno-utopianist. in that I think because of the evolution of how MP's expenses broke as a story, it gave me a lot of hope in just the technology of digitizing information as a thing of liberation, because it's always been the case that knowledge is power, and so those in power seek to control knowledge, and they could do that very easily when information had a physical mass to it. And once it became digitized, it became more ephemeral, and it became incredibly difficult to control. And that's really how a lot of the MP's expenses story got loose. It did start out very, very traditionally, where I ended up in a court case, and it was all about, physical paper documents. But then, as a result of winning that court case, all of the documents were digitized, and then they were put on this disc. And it was the fact that they were all on quite a small disc. Somebody was able to make a copy of that disc and then hawk it around Fleet Street and sell it, which they did because Parliament was, even though they were supposed to publish it, kept delaying and dragging their feet about it, and it looked like it was never going to be published. And then this leak made sure that it was. So that's really the root of my techno-utopianist. But then since then, my views become a lot more nuanced, and I've noticed two things. I don't know maybe I'll just talk about them briefly now, and then I might return to each one separately later on. But the two things are about ignorance in the age of information. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently. And I've been thinking about it because I teach journalism, and people may know that journalism has kind of undergone a massive disruption, almost destruction. Particularly civic journalism. The numbers of reporters who cover civic institutions has absolutely been decimated. And what you end up finding now is that there are real holes in our democracy, black holes of no information, because institutions that used to be covered very well and very thoroughly are now almost, there's almost no coverage of them. So for example, our courts used to be covered very regularly by reporters, and now they're not, because all of the news institutions have lost money and hemorrhaged staff. And so that whole sway of the courts now are just like unknown to most people. Local councils are the same. People don't know what's happening in their local council. In America, the number of State House reporters has plummeted, and a lot of them now are no longer professionals with a lot of experience. They're students who come into it, right in the heart of this incredibly Machiavellian institution, and they're coming into it as students, and they're the main people covering state houses. So that's one thing that worries me, is that we think we're in this great sort of democratized age of information, but actually when you look at the kind of information that there is, I see real black holes that are very troubling for our democracy and our understanding of democracy. Which then kind of leads me to the second thing, which is the way that when we look to technology to solve problems, which are mostly political problems, it's the easy way out. And that's what I saw with and I'm sure you're going to address this, but I saw it with a lot of the hacktivists that I covered. Part of the reason I named my last book, The Revolution Will Be Digitized, was because I was so filled with this great sort of hope about hacktivists and the way they were going to change society for the better and make it more democratic. And then I saw that actually they were very good at dealing with people who agreed with them, and they were not very good at dealing with people who didn't agree with them. And this is really the essence of politics, which is that you take a group of people whose interests will inevitably clash. We don't all have the same interests on everything. And the whole point of politics is that it's a system that takes all these divergent interests and tries to bring them together into a pragmatic consensus where we can solve common problems. And suddenly I started to feel that all these radical people actually weren't interested in solving common problems. They just had their view and they wanted to impose it. And if they didn't get to impose it, they became very aggressive and bullying. And I thought, well, this is not the revolution as I wanted it to be or understood it to be. And in fact, it's nothing like how I what democracy is supposed to be. And I really went right back after this to reading ancient Greeks and learning about ancient... I just love that speech that Sarah Churchill gave right now, because I just found exactly this thing that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of the way we understand politics, it's already been discussed at length, and they had some very good solutions. Again, you look to the Enlightenment, and I think it is an absolute role model of how to look at politics and how to solve problems. So it's not so much the technology, that's the easy way out, to think we can solve these difficult problems just by new tools. Actually, I think we do have to go back and think with what is important in our society, and really what it is our Enlightenment values, our liberal values that were developed in ancient Greece, our politics. We have a lot of models to go on that. And I worry that the way young people are being educated now, they're not taught about civics, they're not taught about democracy, they don't understand civic institutions, they don't understand political institutions. And I feel that that's very, very worrying to me.
Thanks, Heather. We'll move straight on to Dr. Rocket.
Hello, I am Doc Rocket. I guess I'm not too sure what people do or don't know about hacktivists or hacktivism. That's sort of a loose term.
Assume nothing.
Okay, Barry says assume nothing. The general idea behind hacktivism is that seeking transparency from government institutions, also from corporations, is a very difficult thing these days. Those who have power, as the previous commenter mentioned, are able to protect their secrets very well. And so the general public and people who have an interest in certain things that the government is doing which they refuse to disclose, as well as corporations, I suppose is across the board, don't really have access to that data. There are standard processes that one can use, like the Freedom of Information Act. People can file an FOI request to try to obtain information that the government is holding on to that has never been either covered by a reporter or never been released prior. But there are many times where governments refuse to release that information. And so the sort of concept behind hacktivism is that there are individuals who have certain skills and have the ability to infiltrate these data systems. And they go in and they look for information and they mine this data and they take it out and eventually leak it. A high-profile example of this would be the hacktivist Jeremy Hammond, if anyone's familiar with him. He's an activist who became sort of enraged with the system and how it operated. He had been an activist, a so-called, what we say now, on-the-ground activist for many years, protesting, a wide range of things that grievances he had with the government, the United States government, and became sort of enraged with the idea that the U.S. government was holding on to so many secrets. I think the sort of opening into his story begins around the Occupy Wall Street protests, where in the U.S., activists who were partaking in these protests were being spied on by the federal government. Our privacy was it was a really bad situation what was happening to the activists in the U.S. And so he was very angry about this and sort of went on a mission to figure out what had been happening, how much they were listening to, how many people they were following, and what the whole sort of background story was. There are groups like the Civil Liberties Union. There is a group called Muckrock. These are people who tried really hard to get this information. Attorneys that work together with FOIA and all different kinds of legitimate means, quote unquote legitimate means to get data from the government, who were unsuccessful in helping activists figure out what was going on. And as it turns out, the FBI had been following us and collecting enormous amounts of data, personal information, on all of the activists and organizers in Occupy Wall Street. And one of the ways that we knew this was through a hack that Jeremy Hammond performed on a group called Stratfor. I won't really get into who they are, but if you don't know who they are, Google it. They're a pretty dark entity. So basically the idea is that it's sort of, a person like Jeremy would see hacking into these systems as sort of civil disobedience, a way of bringing transparency out from a group that's refusing to comply. In this case, it was the United States government, or many governments were exposed actually through his hack. So that's kind of one way to look at it. Another example, and people do not call this individual a hacktivist, but it's a somewhat related issue, would be whistleblowers. So, for example, someone like Chelsea Manning, who was working for the United States military, bore witness to war crimes at his station as an analyst. And what wound up happening was, Chelsea Manning became extremely conflicted with what to do with the data that she had seen. And she made the decision to leak the information to the public for the public's benefit, so that people in the public could understand what we had been doing and the egregious human rights violations that the United States government was involved with in Iraq and Afghanistan and several other, in Guantanamo, etc. So the idea behind both concepts of whistleblowing and hacktivism in the digital realm and what it means in terms of data is that there is some level of lack of access to data that the public deserves to have. And these people are basically working to bring those sort of dark pockets of information into the light.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Doc. We'll now move on to Sebastian Groes. Sebastian.
Thank you, Barry. So I'd like to respond by backtracking a little bit, by looking basically what's happening to us, to our self-image, and maybe to our identities a little bit. And some of the discussions that I've been having with the Memory Network brought me back to something that Virginia Woolf claimed in 1922, 1923, I think. She claimed that in 1910, human character changed, the nature of identity and the way of being changed at the start of the 20th century. And this had to do with all sorts of rapid changes in society, democratization, capitalism, of course also the First World War. And I'd like to claim that human character is changing rapidly at this stage as well, around this period. And it reminded me of something that Barry said about the extending of ourselves through technologies, through all sorts of tools, social media. And this is something that I've been thinking about, and I call this the prosthetic God. It's a Freudian term, but it's about how through cognitive offloading we are constantly distributing ourselves across all sorts of different platforms, different media, different kinds of storage systems. And I think that's very important because it fundamentally changes our ontology. That's maybe a bit of a fancy word. The digital self, I think, is very important to investigate how this interacts in this particular context that we are facing. The way we construct ourselves via social media, for instance, is very important. the way we fictionalize ourselves through, through Facebook and other forms of social media. I think this is important to investigate, and therefore, again, like Sarah Churchwell, I'd like to make a claim for the humanities and particularly literature, because literature is, of course, a tool that allows us to think about how fiction works and how narratology works. So maybe later we can discuss this. It also reminded me, when we think about this changing self, of Slavoj Žižek, who pointed out that there is this kind of tragicomic inversion of the original panopticon taking place. The idea that we want privacy, we want some kind of space where we can be ourselves and reflect and resist the power of the states or capitalist forces, and that is now inverse, it's reversed. We kind of invite this gaze all the time. Which leads me to a second point, and this is the fetish of privacy. And I sometimes think that privacy is being fetishized by large numbers in the population, and I think privacy is partly a construct. It's a kind of a fetish that emerged in the 19th century, particularly with the burgeoning middle classes who were kind of cultivating secrets. And I'm not saying that having a private domain in which you can reflect upon the world, reflect upon power and potentially resist power, that's a wonderful thing. But the fetish of that, I think, is often not a very good thing. And it brought me to a wonderful book by Dave Eggers called The Circle. I'm not sure if you have read this. It's kind of an investigation on how Google kind of operates, and it's a dystopian kind of engagement with the processes that we are living through. And again, this is really a writer's thing, I think. Eggers makes the claim for privacy. We need to not expose ourselves all the time. We need to not be so addicted to likes on Facebook by all sorts of kinds of recognition. And maybe I'll read a chunk from The Circle later on. But I think the fetish of privacy, I think we need to maybe discuss that and unpick that. The last thing that I maybe want to make a claim for again is the cognitive machinery of the novel and literature in particular. Literature shows us how to order disorder, and I think the engagement with the human mind, with a novel, is very apt in doing that. It's kind of a training mechanism that shows what we can do with big data as well, and all sorts of content. So that's extremely important. It's also the function of the novel, or one way of reading a novel, as a way of unstitching discourses and language. We just heard again the idea of the system and the machinery in which we are caught up, and I sometimes think that discourse itself is kind of part of the slavery to that kind of rhetoric. So again, the novel is a way of unstitching that. And I'd be happy to kind of engage in a debate later on. So for now, thank you.
Sebastian, thank you. Thank you for that. And now we're going on to Ben Hammersley. Ben.
Good evening, everybody. I feel very honoured to be in such august surroundings, surrounded by such brilliant people and academics and so on. I'm not really an academic, I'm mostly a futurist, which is a terrible job title for somebody who's employed to live a couple of years in the future and then come back and tell you all about it. And that sort of, traditionally at this sort of point in this sort of introduction of this sort of talk, I would quote William Gibson, the novelist, who said that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And so part of my job, as Barry said earlier, is to go around the world and sort of collect evidence of the future happening already and then come back and tell people about it. And recently, over the past couple of years, I've been doing increasing numbers of academic fellowships and so on in different countries. And last year I was in Florence in Italy, and I was extraordinarily nervous when I turned up on the first day of term, as you're likely to be. And somebody took me aside and said, look, the trick here is that you don't have to be right, you just have to be wrong in interesting ways. And that really, I think, is really the key to some of these debates, I think, in that pretty much everybody is wrong about the thing they think about privacy, but they're all wrong in really interesting ways. And I think it's very valuable to have a think about the different ways that people are wrong about these things. And so, as people were talking, I was noting down 3 or so areas where I think people are wrong, but they're wrong in interesting ways, and that can be used to lead on to further bits of this debate. The first one is really, I think, about technical capability. The general discourse around privacy does not take into account any solid knowledge of the technical capability that is around today. Whenever I speak to politicians or civil servants in the UK and in many other countries, their knowledge of the technical capabilities of not only the general computing world, but specifically the agencies that work for them, and specifically the security agencies that we're sort of, not mentioning, but the ones that we're really here to talk about, they really just don't get precisely how powerful the technology is today. Since the early 60s, all of humanity has been living under the condition known as Moore's Law, which is the fact that roughly every 12 to 18 months, for the same price, computing power doubles. And it's doubled year on year on year since the early 60s, which means that the iPhone 5S, the rubbish now iPhone that I have in my pocket, is 3 times as powerful as the Cray 3 supercomputer, which was the most powerful computer in the universe in 1980. It's the one at the end of Superman 3, by the way, the one with the sofa built into it. It's a very cool computer. Nevertheless, the amount of computing and processing power that's available today gives, and as Nigel will be able to talk to you about, the sort of machine learning capabilities and artificial intelligence that if we took it back in time 3 or 4 years, would seem to be witchcraft. Amazon, as an example, last week released a machine which sits called the Amazon Echo, which sits in the middle of your living room and listens to your voice continuously, and when you talk to it, will give you answers to any question you want. You can ask it by going out to the internet and finding answers to that question. That is witchcraft technology. It costs $99. So the sort of technological capability that we have is more than you possibly can imagine, and will double in capability. And that's a very, very important point, specifically when you're talking to people who are attempting to regulate things, or think that they are on top of the regulation of certain technologies, because usually they're not, because they don't quite know the limits, they don't know the lack of limits to the capability. The second way that people are interestingly wrong when we're talking about privacy is from the campaigners for more privacy. And that's the underestimation of the systemic importance of computer networks, and specifically the security of computer networks. The privacy debate at the moment seems to be set up between activists and governments, and usually the way that it breaks down, if you hear this on the Today program in the mornings, you'll have somebody talking about the importance that people don't get spied on, and then you'll have somebody from one of the law enforcement agencies or intelligence agencies who'll talk about terrorism and child pornography and organised crime and drug trafficking and all of those things, and they'll be set up as an impossible debate. I have, and Heather has, and I'm sure everyone in this room has sat on panels where we've given our deeply moral and ethical reasoning why we shouldn't have government intrusion and surveillance and so on, and then somebody from one of the law enforcement agencies will stand up and say, well, that means you support the child pornographers. And that shuts the argument down completely. But actually, they do kind of have a point. And this is a very difficult thing for activists to necessarily understand, is that the computer networks that we're talking about securing are more important than we can possibly imagine. Many people are quite nostalgic and quite like to shut the internet down, but if you did, the world would collapse instantly. Pretty much every part of our existence is now in the digital network. As we said earlier, I have a TV show about cybercrime. Episode 3 is on iPlayer now, because you missed it because it was on 4:30 this afternoon, but nevertheless, it's very good. And the more and more I was making that series, the more I realised that pretty much, as I say, every single part of our life is touched by this network. And so the security of that network and the security of the stuff that goes over that network is really inherent to the continuation of our civilization. And I don't say that lightly. And so from one hand, the intelligence agencies and the law enforcement people and the governments who want to keep this stuff locked down or surveilled or whatever actually do kind of have a point. But they're also wrong in another interesting way, which is that they massively underestimated the importance of these technologies to the individual. The intimacy of that connection of the digital technologies to the individual is beyond compare. Everybody in this room, I would imagine, for example, has a smartphone in their pockets or at least in their hands right now. And we know, medically speaking, that if you've had a smartphone for more than a year, it actually becomes deeply entwined with your mental biology. There is, if anybody here has had a smartphone for more than a year, at least a tiny bit at the back of your head which is constantly thinking about your phone. It's constantly thinking, right now, I know it is, you're thinking, is it ringing? Is it ringing? Is it ringing? Is it, oh, I hope I turned it off. Is it ringing? Is it ringing? Should I check Twitter? Is it ringing? And you're constantly thinking that. Now we know this, there have been many experiments that show that this is the case, one of the most famous ones being 3 studies, the last one at Harvard, that show that sometimes this bit of the brain that is monitoring your phone will go wrong, and you will, like you have deja vu, that sort of thing, and you will feel your phone vibrating in your pocket when it's not. It's called a phantom vibration. 95% of you will have had one of these. And that goes to show the entwined nature of the device and your psyche. And that entwined nature of the device and the psyche and all of the things you do through that device means that the network and all of the data that goes over it is a deeply important part of your life. I get criticised a lot at home for looking at my phone all of the time, as many people in this room might. And my brilliant answer, I have to say, is that I'm not looking at my phone, I'm looking at the world through my phone. Feel free to use it. And now, the point of saying this is that the agencies and governments and so on who would like to surveil that stuff are vastly underestimating how intimate that data is to me. And me, thinking that that data is incredibly intimate, are vastly underestimating how important that whole system is to everybody else. And between us, we're radically underestimating precisely how complex these systems now are. And this is why we get these very interesting complications with, for example, hacktivists, where we have a philosophical mix-up between technical skill and moral authority. That there is sometimes a feeling that because you can do it, then you're morally obliged to do so, for example. Now, all of this, again, to finish up, should be seen within the wider context of the evolution of political thought over the past 10 years or so, and specifically within the wider context of a lack of trust in institutions. I will posit, and I think this sort of leads on to the GCHQ and SA debate, that one of the issues that we face is that the very agencies and the very institutions that are asking for access into the deeply intimate parts of our lives through these networks have proven themselves over the past 20 years or so to be deeply untrustworthy, either ideologically or very practically speaking. We don't really know if that's the case with the secret agencies, but we certainly know, just by reading newspapers, that that's the case with the Metropolitan Police, for example. And so we face now a very, very interesting question, a very interesting situation where literally everyone is wrong, which I seem to think is a very fine way to start off a debate. Right?
Thank you all very much. Okay, that's beautifully poised. I'm going to just let Nigel have a couple of minutes to pick up on and respond to any of those things, and then I'm going to try and raise a few more issues from what you said.
Actually, I think you should just step.
Okay. So I was interested in a few lines of, there was a lot of agreement, there were a few lines of tension. One of the things I seemed to get from what you said then was that there's a shared interest between the hacktivist community and the intelligence services in keeping those networks going. So I mean, people who, for pernicious reasons, wanted to take the networks out, wanted to deny service or wanted to deny the technical capability, would actually, for cyber terrorist reasons, would actually like to take them down. So there's a funny sense in which both the security services, big companies and hacktivists want to keep the possibility of communicating through these services available. So there's a funny sharing of value there. And then the other issue is that for hacktivists, and this comes to Doc, and I wanted you two to talk about this a little first, denial of service to somebody is, of course, not giving them the right to speak, but you're also very committed to the idea that people should have the possibility, as Nigel said, of having their voice, having their reply, and I'm sure that's an issue that touches on something that was also mentioned by Heather on just that point about whether or not one only politically wants to hear from the people you agree with, or whether you want there to be a debate and discussion from the other side too. I'm going to come back to fetishizing privacy later, but that's an issue. But first, can I have your thoughts about the sort of strange bedfellows that are, or the sort of unholy alliance of activists and the Secret Service community?
Well, depending on which rumours you believe, then they are actually the same people, but nevertheless, we can go into that another day. I think all of these debates really come down to what's really a mismatch of context. I was in a conversation in Chatham House with, so as soon as I said that I realised I can't actually tell you.
Chatham House rules, no.
Yeah. Imagine once upon a time there was somebody who had a conversation with somebody who used to have a job title that consisted of a single letter.
C or M?
Couldn't possibly comment. Nevertheless, there are helicopters above. This gentleman said to me, look, it's all very well us talking about privacy and all of those sort of things. However, you have to admit, there are bad guys. And they genuinely are really, really, really bad guys. Occupy, not bad guys. There are some real bad guys. And the modern world consists mostly of the network and stuff that's connected to it. And so, given both of those facts, what do we expect as a civil society those agencies to do? Like, it's genuine. That's not just a philosophical problem. It is actually it's a genuine practical issue. And so, when you think about that, and then you think about the genuine importance of those networks, I think we face a risk where when we're talking about the internet, we think of only the internet that we ourselves experience. So when we think about internet surveillance, for example, we think about the conversations that we personally have by email, the conversations that we personally have with our friends via Facebook, the political activism that we do via the different social networks, and that's it. And we think about the surveillance and the law enforcement and so on solely within our own personal context. The national intelligence agencies think about it in a much wider context. And then the technology firms themselves, who've recently come under a lot of criticism, for example, the new incoming head of GCHQ last week or the week before gave this speech where he said, both in an op-ed in the FT, where he said that Google and Apple and so on weren't cooperating with the domestic agencies. What he was missing was that they operate in a much wider context themselves, and that the privacy lockdowns that they have in their hardware are not in order to foil the NSA and GCHQ, but to prevent all of the iPhone users in China who might want to be using iPhones for dodgy things from going and being shot in the head, right? It's again a wider and wider context. And so I think everybody picks their own place and then sees the rest of the argument from their own standpoint, and that's why I say everybody is wrong, because everybody is right for their own particular thing, and is rational, is intelligent, and is usually not evil. They're usually, good people making the best of a bad world, but they're wrong with the wider context.
But it's hard to compare those judgments with
completely impossible, yeah.
Can we hear from Doc and then from Heather?
I do want to address the denial of service thing, part that you mentioned. denial of service or a DDoS or DDoS attack from hacktivists. This is something Barry mentioned within the context of this conversation. Why would anybody want to sort of silence another person? I wouldn't necessarily frame it that way, or I wouldn't necessarily say that that's what DDoS is used for in the correct context. Again, everything is sort of through perspective. Cyber criminals use DDoS to bring down servers or companies that operate for their own malintent. But activists can use that exact same form of attack to for civil disobedience, essentially. So in the case of, let's say, I'm trying to use high-profile cases that might make more sense. There's a group of people called the PayPal 14. The PayPal 14 are a group of activists who use this type of cyber attack. It's a very basic thing. I'm saying cyber attack, I'm making it sound like it's something crazy. It's a really simple concept of DDoS. What they essentially did was PayPal had decided to blockade WikiLeaks from receiving donations. And so this group of people thought, well, hey, that's wrong. WikiLeaks is a journalist endeavor and people should be able to leak these state secrets. And why is PayPal blocking people from donating? We don't like this. In the real world, IRL, not digital, if a bank were performing or doing something that you didn't like, you might go in front of that bank as an activist and link arms and prevent people from going in and out as a form of protest, as a form of civil disobedience. You might block workers from going in that day to make a statement. You might hold signs outside and picket. This is what we do to voice, our opinion on matters. And a DDoS attack is essentially the same sort of thing. There's a bunch of people who got together and used software to repeatedly hit the PayPal website so many times, billions of times, so that the website was no longer operating, so that other people just could not access it. It's exactly the same thing as a bunch of people linking arms in front of a bank. And so it's not really meant to silence as much as it is to amplify the voices of those who aren't being heard.
Okay, Heather.
I want to address, I just thought about the DDoS thing, which, what was interesting about that PayPal thing, though, it's sort of a misnomer to say it was a big democratic movement, because actually the thing that really shut down PayPal wasn't like just a lot of random volunteers, it was some professional hackers who have hundreds of thousands of machines at their disposal, and if you persuade one or two people, that's all it takes to get them to activate their machines to shut down a site. That's not particularly democratic. So that's one of the issues I have about the whole hacktivist movement. But what I wanted to talk about was, just to bring it back to the humanities, was something about Ben's talking about the pressure that intelligence agencies and law enforcement are under to solve crimes and to stop bad things happening. And this is where we can just look back throughout history, because this is not a new debate. Do we want the police and law enforcement to be as efficient as possible? Actually, no, we don't. And we've had this debate throughout the centuries, because what we've seen is if we make it very, very easy for the police to invade the rights of a private citizen to solve crimes, it actually ends up to the detriment of the overall public interest. That in fact you want it to be a bit difficult for the police to invade the rights of a citizen and to get their information. Because that's a balance that we've struck through lots of debate throughout the centuries. It was talked about in ancient Greece, it's been talked about in the Enlightenment, you can read the Federalist Papers, it's throughout American history, when they had this, whether they were going to pass the Sedition Act. This is not a new debate, and this is again why I'm a bit worried, because the intelligence agencies peddle out these ideas, as the head of GCHQ did last week. And I sort of think, like, we've had this debate dozens of times before, that actually in a democracy, if we want a strong democracy, we actually don't want it to be, we want there to be some things that these people have checks on their power, because what we've seen in the past is actually the danger isn't always from an external enemy, it can actually be internal, and it can be our own law enforcement, it can be our own intelligence services who are the enemy within, and that's why we need to have a check on their power. So that's just to bring it back to the humanities element.
No, I think that's a really interesting point. It speaks to Ben's issue that there is part of the problem we face is it's rooted in Moore's law, and which has been this relentless increase in power and scope of computing. When I started in AI a few decades ago now, I was assured by my professors at Edinburgh that a human chess champion of the world would not be beaten by a machine because the search space was so large, not for decades. Well, precisely 18 years later, it happened, okay. And that was, and they knew the slope. The initial points on Moore's law had been plotted. They knew how fast it was doubling, but the ability to understand what that would do to the world, and we now see that not just with the speed of processors, the network effects that's been talked about, the speed of comms, the rates of connectivity, the ubiquitous nature of all of this means that we are busy installing a digital nervous system which is extraordinarily powerful, and we are not ourselves aware of its full contingencies and capacities. So that when you do a denial of service attack, you don't quite know what all the people trying to do really important things across the PayPal network, how they've been disenfranchised. And that's really difficult for people to understand. And I think the really powerful thing about this kind of discussion and debate is that it allows us to flush out the nuances and complexities. It allows us to understand that potentially these reacquainting people with old arguments is just the most important thing we can do. These are old, enduring arguments about limitless power, about what happens when it gets just too easy to do something to the detriment of somebody else. I actually think that in this sense, the agencies and many other organisations are barely keeping up with Moore's law. Of course they have the power to put it to work, and they now can do bulk collection on a level we might never have imagined. But the need for checks and balances, the need for the notion of what it is to be accountable in this new context, and they've got this massive power, they'll put it to work to their primary mission, and until they're asked the hard questions around proportionality and accountability, they'll put it to work in that way. And I think it's everybody believes they're working in their own context to the ends they are, and they barely understand how these things knock on. And I think that's what's so interesting about this debate. Now, of course, when we come on to issues of what that's doing to the notion of private autonomy, I think that is really quite interesting, because I think it's more than just a fictive convenience of the 19th century, but perhaps have a conversation.
We'll come back to that. Ben, you wanted to comment immediately.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think one of the things with Moore's law and that doubling of power that it's really markedly missing from this sort of debate is that exponential growth. Because if you do the maths in your head, the numbers get very big very quickly. That's the whole point of Moore's law, the doubling and doubling and doubling. The capability, that doubling capability, has vastly outstretched our ability to talk about it. It's specifically outstretched the vocabulary we have, the critical language that we have to discuss these things. The word privacy, for example, is completely meaningless now, right? Because it means so many things that we could have, and everybody here, we could debate it for weeks, and everybody would think we were talking about something else. So one of the real problems we have is that the technical complexity has been matched by a theoretical or a language complexity that we can use to discuss it. So that's an issue where the humanities really need to kick in. Science fiction is always good for these sorts of things because it gives you some sorts of frameworks. And one of the great frameworks in science fiction is the idea of the singularity, right? And there are various versions of it, but one of them is the idea that at a certain point, computing power will get so complex that humans will no longer be able to understand it. And that's always been a thing that has always been, like hard AI, it's always been 10 years out. It's been 10 years out for the past 50 years or so. Until 2008, with the financial crisis, when we realized that in fact the singularity had already happened. It's happened in the financial sector. The financial sector today, for example, yesterday, 80% or so of the bond trades, 80 or so percent of the equity trades here in London were not done by humans, they were done by artificial intelligences. It's been happening for many years now, in fact. It's going to happen more and more. Charles Schwab 2 weeks ago announced a product that they're selling from next year where they will be giving investment advice, where the investment advice will be given by an AI, not by humans. And I will absolutely guarantee you that by 2016 we'll look back at that and go, actually, that Charles Schwab AI is an amazing investor compared to all these humans. Nevertheless, that's realization that we have actually created a world of complexity that is so complex that humans cannot understand it. It's starting to dawn on many people in many sectors. That singularity that happened in the financial sector has meant that we really can't unpick the financial world anymore. There was a very famous thing that happened a couple of years ago called the flash crash, which was the loss on the Chicago Commodities Exchange of about 30% of its value in about a minute. Nobody knows why it happened. All we do know is that all of the AIs that were trading with each other suddenly and inexplicably started to freak out. Now we're having to use anthropomorphic language to discuss this because we literally lack any other form of vocabulary to discuss these things. And so that's why these debates actually, I think, do come back to talking about the Greeks, or talking in a poetic language, or using literature or so on to discuss it, because we don't have the vocabulary to be able to discuss these things in any other way other than in florid metaphors.
I think that's good and very helpful, and we also need people who are quite technologically smart in linguistics and philosophy to think about how we understand the semantics of the information that's on the web, and that's actually becoming quite a puzzling area to study, and it needs both the technical competence but also those very philosophical, rather abstract forms of thinking. And it's not surprising on a day when you've seen the film of Alan Turing's Life Open that it was people who were trained in mathematical logic and philosophy who were doing this, and in a way we then started to train people who were born computer scientists instead of coming from those areas, but we need to get some of the expertise back into the technical area, I think. Let me take on, we're going to pause the singularity. I usually ban any discussion of that in philosophy, but I want to return to this issue of privacy. And I was quite surprised, I think, as Nigel was, about the idea that privacy is just a sort of fetishized construction, because a good remark made by Ian McEwan, who I know Sebastian knows and has indeed written books about, that he said the first time an individual learns to lie or keep a secret, that's when they become a self, and that's when they become separated from others. And there's some sense in which we've always wanted to have places in ourselves that we do keep to ourselves. And the strange thing is that we now have a technology that allows us to put a lot of ourselves, or even to experiment with ourselves online. Now we did that through fiction, and that was okay, because when we were writing fiction, we were in charge. But the idea is now to be creating something online which we're not entirely in control of and which other people might be participating in. So there's both extending yourself and the idea of other people extending you, which I think is the moment at which it becomes a little frightening, a little scary. So the issues around privacy and around boundaries of self, I think, are different because of the technology. So not sure about it just being fictionalized, but we may be clinging to something that we have really, since we became a species who could think of ourselves as individual minds, have always worried about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're living through this moment of transactive cognition, and we are extending ourselves, and we are creating this group mind or hive mind, I think is one of the terms. And Dave Eggers, he's kind of arguing against that. He's kind of afraid that the idea of group cognition, collective cognition, will in the end regress, and it will sort of pull us downward towards the baser kind of impulses. So there's maybe a Freudian reading to do. He's afraid of it collapses back into some kind of mob mentality. And I think this is something that he's afraid of. And I was thinking about why writers are always so interested in advocating privacy and having material, physical spaces where you can be by yourself and reflect upon the world. And of course, I think partly this is to do with the very fact of the writing activity, which takes place in such an isolated environment. And I think we do need material, physical spaces for isolation, but I would make the claim, this is something that Ben just said, and you kind of also said, Barry, that we need independent, imaginative spaces. And again, the idea of the novel, I think, as a cognitive machinery that creates this kind of imaginative isolation between the mind of the reader and the novel, is extremely important. It trains us into independent thinking, in creating some kind of imaginative autonomy, and therefore I think that the novel form, in particular, I mean, McEwan's work as well, is vital for our kind of survival of the idea of privacy.